The evening air in Denver carried a gentle warmth, but a sudden chill ran across my skin as I stood on the rooftop of our house. The roof was bathed in a soft glow from the nearby streetlights, and it seemed alive with laughter and conversations. People gathered around high tables, exchanging greetings and hugs. Yet all of this felt like background noise to me, distant, as if I were watching from the outside. My husband, Michael, stood a little farther away, engrossed in a conversation with his colleagues. I watched him for a moment, but my gaze drifted beyond him. It felt as if we were on opposite sides of the party, each lost in our own separate worlds. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" His voice snapped me back to the moment, sounding sharp, almost like an echo in my mind. Michael glanced at me, his expression concerned, but before I could respond, he turned back to his conversation, barely waiting for my reply. It was then I realized how disconnected I felt. As I stood there, David appeared next to me. David was in his late 40s, tall and confident, with a bit of grey starting to show in his dark hair. He had always been charming, but tonight there was something different about his smile. It was warmer than usual, lingering a little longer on me than what felt appropriate. "You seem a bit bored at your own party," he said, with a soft chuckle, standing closer than usual. I shrugged, trying to hide my unease. David always had a way of noticing the little things that others missed. It wasn't a surprise that he could read my mood tonight. Maybe I should have left the party, I thought, but something held me back. Perhaps it was the way David's attention felt, personal, sincere, as though he truly saw me. I hesitated, unable to find the right words to express what I was feeling. What could I say? That I felt like a stranger at a party meant to celebrate my husband? That the people here, whom I thought were friends, were merely colleagues I couldn't connect with? I remained silent. David's eyes, usually calm, now reminded me of the stillness before a storm. "You know, Rachel, sometimes I feel like you're not really here with us," he said thoughtfully, his tone gentle but probing. His words struck a chord, and I felt my hands clench into fists. He had touched a raw nerve, but his voice wasn't accusing. Instead, it felt like he was offering me a moment to reflect, to figure out why I felt this way. "I'm just tired," I replied, though I knew it wasn't the full truth. Explaining to him, or even to myself, what I was feeling seemed impossible. David nodded, and a knowing smile crossed his face. "Sometimes you have to be a little selfish," he said, his voice dropping slightly, addressing only me. "You deserve to feel at ease, even if it means breaking a few rules you've set for yourself." His words felt like an invitation, and a strange warmth began to grow inside me, pulling at the corners of my soul. The party continued around us, the clinking of glasses, toasts, and bursts of laughter. Yet, for David and me, time felt suspended. We spoke for a while longer, but our conversation meandered, drifting into stories of travels and memories. But the real event was happening inside me. I caught myself watching his lips move, wondering about the thoughts running through his mind. When his eyes met mine again, I saw a flicker of something new, a spark that hadn't been there before, as if an unspoken line had been crossed. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my imagination, that everything happening was only in my head. But when David's hand almost accidentally brushed against mine, everything changed. A light tremor ran through my body, and I felt something stirring deep within me, something that would be hard to control. I didn't pull my hand away, and in that moment, I realized this was the beginning of something I wasn't ready for. We stood there in silence, and the air between us grew heavier. David stepped back, giving me the chance to retreat to reality, but I couldn't look away. I felt strange, not frightened, but rather intrigued by the feelings stirring within me. "Rachel!" Michael's voice suddenly called out, snapping me back to the party. I turned to see him waving, inviting me to join a group gathered around one of the tables. I nodded, forcing a smile, but even as I walked away, I could still feel David's gaze burning into my back. I knew that this evening had set something in motion. something that would be difficult to stop. The days that followed were a blur. I tried to push the memory of David's gaze and the warmth of his touch out of my mind, but it refused to leave me. When Michael suggested that we accept David's invitation for dinner, I felt a pang in my chest. My fingers tightened around the armrest of my chair as I agreed with a smile, though inside a wave of anxiety rose up, threatening to drown me. David's house, located in a charming neighborhood in Greenwood Village, one of Denver's suburban gems, always felt cozy and inviting. It was surrounded by tall trees with a perfectly manicured garden that seemed to offer peace and privacy. But today, as we stepped inside, I felt a subtle tension in the air, as if the room had grown warmer, the air thicker. David greeted us at the door with his usual warm smile, but when his eyes landed on me, they lingered a moment longer than necessary. It was almost imperceptible to anyone else, but I noticed. And from the slight shift in his expression, I could tell he knew I noticed as well. Dinner began uneventfully. Michael, as usual, dominated the conversation, talking about work projects, repeating jokes I had heard countless times. David laughed along, nodding in agreement. But every time David spoke to me, I could feel his attention, his eyes fixed on me in a way that felt different. At first, it was casual, friendly, just the kind of engagement you'd expect from a gracious host. But as the evening progressed, his comments and questions grew more personal. "You look stunning tonight, Rachel," he said, his voice softening as though his words were meant for me alone. "Thank you," I replied, smiling, but I felt something shift inside me. I felt Michael's presence fade into the background as if he were part of a different world. After dinner, David offered to walk us to our car. I assumed it was just part of his hospitality, but as we stepped outside, something changed in his demeanor. The wind rustled the branches of the trees, and I could hear their gentle whispers in the darkness. As we approached the car, I felt his gaze slowly shifting toward me, unhurried, almost lingering. When we reached the car, David opened the door for me and I felt his presence. Too close, too intense. Michael was saying something, but his words barely registered. All I could hear was my heartbeat, drumming loudly in my ears and the tension between David and me. He leaned in a little closer, his gaze locked on my face, lingering longer than it should have. For a moment, time seemed to freeze and I felt as if I were standing on the edge of something. "Thank you for a wonderful evening," David said, his voice deeper, more intimate. I nodded, unable to speak. All I had to do was get into the car and drive away, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something important had happened, something I could no longer ignore. As the car pulled away, I glanced back, watching David's house fade into the distance. But my thoughts remained with him, lingering in that brief moment when his eyes held mine. I tried to tell myself that it was nothing, that it was just a fleeting moment of excitement. But the truth was undeniable. That evening had awakened something inside me, something that refused to be silenced. I felt as if I were standing on the brink of an abyss, one where every step forward would change everything. The following Saturday morning, I suggested to Michael that we take a walk in Sloan's Park, one of our favorite spots in Denver. It had always been our place to unwind, to escape the busyness of life and spend time together. But this time, he declined. "Rachel, I have some urgent matters to attend to," he said, quickly buttoning his shirt. "I'll be back later, maybe in the evening." "Again?" I muttered, unable to hide the frustration in my voice. It was always something, always work, always urgent matters. He looked at me with an apologetic smile as if to say, "You know how it is." I nodded, not wanting to make a scene. There had been too many moments like this where I would try to reach out to him, only to be met with that same indifferent look. I knew he would leave soon and once again I would be left alone. The silence that followed his departure felt heavier than usual. It wrapped around the house, pressing against me, making me feel suffocated. I decided to take that walk in the park alone, hoping the fresh air might clear my mind. As I wandered along the winding paths shaded by towering trees, I heard a voice call my name. Rachel. I turned around, and there was David, standing in the morning sunlight, looking as though he had just stepped out of a dream. He wore a casual light blue shirt with sleeves rolled up, his expression warm and inviting. David, I greeted him, trying to keep my voice steady. What are you doing here? Taking a walk, he replied with a smile. Just like you, I suppose. He gestured to the path ahead. May I join you? Sure, I answered, my heart beating a little faster. We strolled through the park together, exchanging small talk about the weather and the latest news in the city. But soon our conversation shifted to more personal matters. How are things with Michael? David asked, his tone more serious now. He kept his gaze ahead, but I knew he was waiting for my answer. The usual, I shrugged, trying to appear casual, but I could feel my voice betraying me. He's been really busy lately, David nodded, as if he had expected my response. He seems to be working all the time. But what about you? How are you really? The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard, and I hesitated. I don't know, I finally admitted. Sometimes it feels like I'm just drifting. We reached a secluded pond, hidden away from the main paths of the park. The water was still, mirroring the clouds and trees above it, just as it reflected the thoughts swirling inside me. We stood there, side by side, the silence between us almost tangible. You deserve to be happy, Rachel, David said softly. You shouldn't have to settle for just drifting through life. Do you ever feel trapped? I asked, unable to hold the question back any longer. Like you're living a life you didn't choose for yourself? David glanced at me, his eyes full of an understanding that felt almost comforting. All the time, he confessed. But sometimes you have to find your own way out, even if it means breaking a few rules. I turned to face him, and in that moment, everything seemed to come into sharp focus. The unspoken tension between us, the way his eyes lingered on mine, the warmth of his hand as it brushed against mine, it all felt like a magnetic pull, drawing us closer together. Rachel, he said, my name sounding like a whisper on his lips. He took a step closer, his hand lightly resting on my arm, and I could feel the heat radiating from his skin. I could have stepped back, I could have laughed it off, but I didn't. Instead, I allowed myself to lean in, to let go of the doubts that had been holding me back. When his lips met mine, it felt as though the world had stopped. This was no longer just a kiss. It was the culmination of all the emotions I had been fighting to suppress. His hands slipped around my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt a wave of warmth wash over me. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Nothing but the two of us. We finally pulled away from each other, breathless and shaken, but we remained close, our foreheads resting together as we tried to catch our breath. The silence between us felt heavy, charged with an electricity I hadn't experienced in years. I shouldn't have, David whispered, his voice rough with emotion. But you did, I replied, my voice trembling. And in that moment, I knew that we had crossed a line, one that couldn't be uncrossed. This kiss wasn't just a mistake, it was the start of something that would change everything. After that morning in the park, I couldn't stop thinking about David. The memory of his touch, the feel of his lips against mine, it was all I could think about. I tried to return to my usual routine with Michael, but everything felt different. Every time he spoke to me or tried to hold me, my mind wandered back to David, and I felt a pang of guilt mixed with a yearning I couldn't ignore. For days I battled with myself, trying to convince myself that what had happened with David was a fleeting moment, a mistake that I could forget. But as hard as I tried, the memory lingered, refusing to fade. One morning I received a text from David. Rachel, I can't stop thinking about you. Meet me at Bellevue Cafe this afternoon. We need to talk. I stared at the message, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew that meeting him again would only make things more complicated, but I couldn't resist. I felt an undeniable pull toward him, one that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. I replied with a simple okay and felt a rush of adrenaline course through me. When I arrived at Bellevue Cafe, I found him sitting by the window, a cup of coffee in front of him. He looked up as I entered, his eyes brightening the moment he saw me. I took a seat across from him, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The air between us felt thick with unspoken words, heavy with the weight of what we had done. "Thank you for coming," he said finally, his voice quiet. "I wasn't sure if you would." "I wasn't sure either," I replied, glancing down at my hands. But I couldn't stay away. David reached across the table, his fingers brushing against mine. "Rachel, what happened between us wasn't just a moment," he said, his eyes searching mine. "You know that, don't you?" I nodded, swallowing hard. "I know," I whispered. "But it's not that simple." "Michael." "I know," he interrupted, pulling his hand back as if burned by the mention of my husband's name. "I know, and I hate myself for putting you in this position, but I can't pretend that I don't want more." My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a mixture of fear and excitement swirl inside me. "What are we doing, David?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Where is this going?" "I don't know," he admitted. "But I do know that I can't stop thinking about you. Every moment I'm not with you feels empty." His words resonated deeply within me. They were the very feelings I had tried to suppress, the emotions I had buried beneath my responsibilities as a wife. I didn't want to hurt Michael, but I couldn't deny that David had awakened something inside me that I thought had long been dead. "I can't promise you anything," I finally said, tears welling up in my eyes. "I'm so confused." David's expression softened, and he reached out once more, gently taking my hand in his. "I'm not asking for promises," he said. "I just want to be with you, even if it's only for a little while." We sat there, our hands intertwined, as the reality of our situation settled in. I knew that meeting him today meant that I had made a choice that would have consequences I couldn't even begin to fathom. After that day at the cafe, things began to unravel even more quickly. The connection between David and me grew stronger, and every stolen moment felt like an escape from the life I had been pretending to live. I started meeting him more often, and each time it became harder to walk away. One evening as I returned home, I noticed Michael's eyes lingered on me longer than usual. He didn't say anything, but I felt a shift in the air, a growing sense of suspicion. "How was your day?" he asked, his tone unusually calm. "Good," I replied, trying to sound as normal as possible, but I could feel the anxiety bubbling up inside me. "Just the usual errands." He nodded but didn't respond, his gaze never leaving my face. I knew then that he could sense something was wrong, that my carefully constructed world was starting to crack. Over the following days, I became more careful, avoiding anything that might give away the secret I was desperately trying to keep. But the truth was, I was living in two worlds. One where I was the devoted wife to Michael, and another where I was the woman who longed to be with David. The two worlds were beginning to collide, and I could feel the impending disaster looming. Then, one afternoon, David called me, his voice laced with urgency. "Rachel, I need to see you. Meet me in Westbridge Park, the same place as before." Westbridge Park was where everything had begun. It was where we had shared our first kiss, where I had first let myself cross that invisible line. I felt my heart leap, torn between fear and excitement. "Okay," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. As I approached the pond in Westbridge Park, I saw him waiting, his silhouette framed by the late afternoon sun. He looked up, and his face lit up with a smile that made my heart ache. "I'm glad you came," he said softly. "David, what's going on?" I asked, my pulse quickening as I moved closer to him. He took a deep breath, reaching out to take my hands in his. "I can't do this anymore, Rachel," he confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't pretend that I don't need you in my life." Tears welled up in my eyes as I shook my head. "We both knew this couldn't last," I said, my voice trembling. It was never supposed to go this far. But it has, he insisted, pulling me closer, his arms wrapping around me. And now, I can't imagine my life without you. I stood there, feeling the warmth of his embrace, the steady beat of his heart against mine, and for the first time I allowed myself to admit the truth. I cared for him, deeply. David, But before I could finish, I caught a movement out of the corner of my eye. Standing just a few feet away, partially hidden by the trees, was Michael. His face was ashen, his eyes wide with disbelief. I felt my heart drop and a wave of nausea washed over me. He had seen everything. Michael, I breathed, stepping away from David, but it was too late. Without saying a word, Michael turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the park. I felt my legs weaken, my mind racing with the realization that everything was falling apart. I turned to David, his face pale with shock. "He knows," I whispered. "He knows everything." David reached for me, his voice desperate. "Rachel, we'll figure this out. No," I interrupted, shaking my head, tears streaming down my face. "I've ruined everything." Without another word, I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my ears, leaving David and the shattered remains of my life behind. I felt like a ghost as I returned home, my heart heavy with dread. The house, which once felt like a sanctuary, now seemed foreign, cold, and unforgiving. I stood at the entrance, gathering the courage to face the inevitable. My fingers shook as I unlocked the door, the sound echoing loudly in the stillness of the house. I found Michael sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the floor. He didn't look up when I entered, but I knew he was waiting for me. "Michael," I began, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I can explain." He lifted his head slowly, and the look in his eyes cut through me like a blade, pain, betrayal, and anger, all mixed into one. "Explain?" he said, his voice cold, almost unrecognizable. "What exactly do you want to explain, Rachel?" I took a step forward, but he raised his hand, stopping me in my tracks. You've been lying to me," he continued, his voice breaking. "I trusted you, Rachel. I thought we had something real." "We did," I protested, my voice trembling. "We do. It's just that I was lost and—" "Lost?" he snapped, rising to his feet. "You weren't lost, Rachel. You made a choice. You chose him." Tears blurred my vision and I felt my heart shatter. "I never meant for it to happen this way," I whispered. "I never meant to hurt you." "But you did," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You hurt me more than I ever thought possible." For a moment we stood there, facing each other, the weight of the silence pressing down on us. Then Michael took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging as though he had been carrying the weight of the world. "I can't do this anymore," he said softly. "I can't keep pretending that everything is okay. It's over, Rachel." "Please, Michael, don't say that," I begged, taking another step toward him. "We can fix this, we can—" "No," he cut me off, his voice firm. "There's nothing left to fix. I've already filed for divorce." The words struck me like a physical blow and I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. "Divorce?" I repeated, the word tasting bitter in my mouth. "Yes," he said, his tone devoid of emotion. "It's done. I want you out of the house by the end of the week." The finality in his voice left no room for argument. I nodded, numbness washing over me, and without another word I turned and walked upstairs. I could still feel his eyes on my back as I climbed each step, and with every step I felt the life I had known slipping further and further away. In my room, I collapsed on the bed, sobs racking my body. I had lost everything, my husband, my home, and the life I had spent years building. All for a moment of passion that now felt empty and meaningless. That night I didn't sleep. Instead, I lay there, staring at the ceiling, reliving every choice that had led me to this moment. How had I let it get this far? How had I let myself become this person? The next morning I did the only thing I could think of. I called David. I needed to hear his voice to feel some sense of comfort, some reassurance that I hadn't lost everything. "Rachel," he answered, his voice tired. "What's going on? Are you okay?" "Michael knows," I whispered, barely able to speak through my tears. "He's leaving me." There was a long pause on the other end, and when David finally spoke, his voice sounded different, colder, more distant. "I'm so sorry," he said quietly, "but maybe it's for the best." "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart sinking. You said you wanted us to be together." "I thought I did," he admitted, and I felt a chill run through me. "But it's complicated, Rachel. More than I realized. I need to fix things with my own family." "You're leaving me?" I choked out, the pain in my chest almost unbearable. "I'm sorry," was all he said before the line went dead. I stared at my phone, the emptiness inside me growing until it threatened to swallow me whole. In that moment, I realized I was truly alone. David had turned his back on me and Michael had walked away, leaving me to pick up the pieces of a life I had destroyed. I sat there staring at my phone, unable to comprehend how everything had fallen apart so quickly. The weight of my decisions, the consequences of my actions, pressed down on me with an unbearable force. I was left alone with nothing but my thoughts and the emptiness that seemed to grow inside me. The following days were a blur. I moved through the motions of packing my things, my mind numb, my heart hollow. The house that had once been my home felt like a stranger's place now, its walls echoing with memories of a life that no longer existed. As I packed the last of my belongings, I took one final look around, trying to etch every detail into my memory. This had been my life, my world, and now it was gone. With my suitcase in hand, I stepped outside, closing the door behind me. The cold air stung my face and I stood there for a moment staring at the house, wondering how it had all come to this. I walked to my car and drove aimlessly through the streets of Denver, not knowing where to go. I felt like a stranger in my own city, surrounded by people who went on with their lives as if nothing had changed, while my own life lay in ruins. Eventually, I found myself back at Westbridge Park, the place where it had all begun. I wandered down the familiar path, feeling the crunch of leaves beneath my feet, and stopped by the pond. The water was still, just as it had been that day with David, and I felt an overwhelming sense of déjà vu. I sat on a bench by the water, hugging my arms around myself, trying to find some sense of warmth, some comfort. But there was none to be found. I was alone, more alone than I had ever been, and that's when I allowed myself to finally cry. Not the quiet tears I had shed before, but deep, heart-wrenching sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of my soul. I cried for the choices I had made, for the love I had lost, for the woman I had become. I cried for the life that had slipped through my fingers, for the family I had shattered, and for the hope that I would never have back. As the tears streamed down my face, I felt the weight of my actions settle on my shoulders, and I knew that there was no turning back. In that moment, I understood that there would be no easy answers, no quick fixes. I would have to face the consequences of my choices to rebuild my life from the ground up, piece by piece. But for now, all I could do was sit by the pond and mourn the life I had destroyed. Hours passed, and the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. I watched as the light faded, replaced by shadows that crept across the park, and as the darkness settled around me, I felt a strange sense of peace, as if the night itself were offering me some form of solace. I knew I had a long road ahead of me, one filled with uncertainty and pain, but I also knew that I had reached the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. And perhaps in time, I could find a way to forgive myself, to learn from my mistakes, and to build a life that was real, a life that was mine. But for now, I would sit here in the darkness, with nothing but the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves, and let myself feel the weight of everything I had lost. And maybe, just maybe, one day I would find a way to start again.